Right, okay, right. So, what's the idea of this? Give you some practical tips within a process for agreeing compensation events so that they're agreed more quickly, amicably, and with less hassle. So there's a bit of research years ago which said, how do individuals judge a project as a success? It's got nothing to do with time, cost and quality outcomes, it's how much hassle I had at a personal level in delivering it. So this is about personal level hassle, minimum hassle. But it's also, at a business level, this bit. Does this work, Glenn? It can't be seen. Anyway, the employer gets better work for less, so less cost of compensation events. The contractor actually makes more profit, which is what they're interested in. Okay. What am I going to talk about? Very little bit about me, an overview of the compensation event process. The main emphasis on this is on the process and tips, and then a little bit, if I have time, of reflection actually, where you get a takeout, and that's where I just give you a bit of time to say what can you apply, basically. So as I'm saying this, think through. If you take, some people say if they go to training or a conference, if there's one bit of useful stuff they can take away and apply, then potentially that's worth a worthwhile use of a day. As I'm going through this, think about the top tip you can take away and apply on your projects and go, that would be helpful and useful. Okay, so very little bit about me. I'm a genuine NEC geek. I'm a genuine geek. I've been called a lot of other things as well. I got involved way back in 1993 when I approached Martin Barnes' wingman, Professor John Perry, and said, basically, all this good stuff that you taught me at university, I've been out on site, and it's not that the theory doesn't work. There is no theory in practice from what I could tell. And this was the University of Birmingham, so he said, have you heard of NEC? So yes, I had heard of the National Exhibition Centre. I nodded my head, and it turned out that he was the co-instigator of it. I did, in that research, I looked at 29 projects in practice, and I interviewed formally 99 people and derived from it various models of good practice. So what we're actually going to talk about is what seemed to work on site when people were agreeing £1 million compensation events in a week, and you go back 20 years and that's £2 million, okay, versus other sites where you got the long tail of a claim, okay, and enhanced by experience, etc. I'll put some other things in there, but I'll get on to the main bit. What we're not talking about is we're not going to be talking about the early warning process. We're not going to be talking about whether it is or isn't a compensation event. We're not going to be talking about whether there's the 8-week time bar applies or not. What we're going to be talking about is why did some people do from give me a quotation and get to acceptance in a week versus others go round and round in a loop of resubmission and so on. Okay? So, why pre-assess? Well, for the employer, you know what you'll pay if you can pre-assess it. Bit of price certainty. That's worth something. For the contractor to pre-price it, you as the employer or the project manager have to give them good quality information, and then they can program it out, price it, work efficiently. Okay? So you pay less. And I'll say now, and I'll say it again, the biggest complaint from contractors when I was doing my research was, we're just told to solve the problem. So we come up with what we think is a good solution, and then we get beaten up by the project manager for not mind reading what wasn't in his actual mind because the project manager actually hadn't thought it through. Okay? So that was one of the biggest. So how can a contractor give a good quotation if they don't know what they've got to do instead? Put simply. Rolling final account, knowing where the project's going, and less man-hours, effort and acrimony versus agreeing a claim or multiple compensation events and rolling them together and all that sort of stuff at the end. Employers, do you want that? Can I just check? Employers? Hands in the air if you're an employer. Hands stay in the air if you want that. Right, okay, right. For contractors, again, we're short on time. Do you want to know what you will receive? Do you want to get better cash flow because once you've done the work you get paid for it? Do you want an incentive to work efficiently and therefore make more profit? Because that was one of the characteristics of contractors who made more profit, was they pre-assessed compensation events. Do you want a rolling final account so you know where your project's heading? And do you want to finish a project and then move on? Contractors, hands in the air. Right, Contractors, do you want that? Yeah, okay, good, right. So, what does it do? What's that? So, prerequisites. Well, first of all, people are talking. Okay, that's a prerequisite to agree things. They're not just sending over bits of paper to each other. There's an environment where people can talk, as in your offices are co-located or very close to each other. You're having regular meetings, etc. I could talk for half an hour on this slide, but I won't. Now, there was, when I was reviewing the slides last night, because I thought I should look at what I was talking about, there is one prerequisite which is missing from this. Any guesses which is missing from a prerequisite for rapidly assessing compensation events? Mr. Hyde would like the answer. Program? Yeah, do you associate Glenn with programming? Possibly, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's an up-to-date, sufficiently detailed program. And by sufficiently, I mean, if the work's in 6 months' time, you don't need it to be as detailed if it's next month. Because if the compensation event's going to be in 6 months' time, hopefully you can do it so there's not going to be disruption. Whereas if it's happening, really soon, there might be disruption, and there needs to be sufficiently detailed within the method statement for that operation to evaluate that. Okay, so moving on. Oh, keep on moving on. Yeah, that's another one there. Right. So now this is the overview of the process. I'll leave you for a few moments to actually look at it. I'm not going to go through that slide because I'll go into the detail of it in the separate slides. But that's for the bigger picture people. If people want to get a feel for it, that's approximately the process. The same slides in at the end. You'll hopefully be able to fill in the detail on each of those. Okay, so first one. In order to identify areas for improvement, identify which compensation event heading it's under, and actually some systems, cloud-based systems, allow you to go back and say, where did that compensation event come from? So was it because the employer changed their mind? Was it due to poor design? Was it because a stakeholder over there changed their mind? And that can both lead to responsibility for it, but it can also lead to continuous improvement, where you say, as an employer, we're changing our mind too much, therefore we need to basically get better at that early on. In terms of assessing it, agree and resolving it, agree the do-nothing consequences, as it gives an insight into how to solve it. So there's a 2-week delay. Oh, it's off the critical path. We've got 3 weeks free float. Well, the natural action then is you monitor it and make sure it doesn't get onto the critical path. Whereas if it's a 2-week delay and it's on the critical path, then actually the nature of the solution is throw money at it to resolve it, because the indirect costs are mounting up at £5,000 a day, and fine-tuning the technical solution might save £1,000 a day. Yeah. So, but that agree the do-nothing consequences of it. As I said before, the biggest issue contractors had is we're not told what we wanted. We're left to guess. And I know from when I was on site, okay, under the ICE form, we were left to guess it, and then we were told, why have you done that? Benefit of hindsight arguments, you should have done that, etc., and so on. Too often the contractor went off and prepared their quotation without forcing the project manager to give them a good brief. So I would say, as contractors, push back at the project manager. Say, I don't know what you want me to do, I don't know what changes you want me to make, I don't know the final result, tell me what you want, let's sit down and agree it before I go off and do the detail, because otherwise we're just going to have to do the work again, because you won't like my quotation, we'll then have to go round the loop again. Let's do it up front. Okay? Describe clearly so the contract give an accurate quotation without lots of unnecessary risk in it. So without lots of unnecessary, shall we say, contractor's assumptions. Yeah. So contractor makes assumptions in their quotation, which so the project manager can go assess, is that accurate? Yeah. Not project manager's assumptions, which can change and are another compensation event. If you're putting in lots of risk as a contractor because you're making lots of assumptions, the project manager won't like it, and you'll revisit it. And also state additional constraints up front. Now, risk. Relevant clauses. Assessment of the effect of a compensation event includes risk allowances for cost and time for matters which have a significant chance of occurring and are at the contractor's risk under this contract. So at the contractor's risk under this contract, up to the point at which they become if they become an additional compensation event. So if the client, the employer, has deleted the physical conditions risk, then the contractor, when a compensation event occurs involving physical conditions, earth moving, can allow more risk premium in theory in that quotation because they're taking all the additional physical condition risk. If the client, the employer, has deleted the weather conditions compensation event, then the contractor can allow more in a quotation as a result of doing that. Have a significant chance of occurring. Martin Barnes, I remember years ago, was asked what a time risk allowance was, and he said, and he started his career on programming, and he said a time risk allowance is the difference between best productivity and expected productivity. So average productivity risks. Now if you take that, do average productivity risks have a significant chance of occurring? Well, on average, yes. Okay? So the contractor, the project manager, doesn't have the authority to screw the contractor down to the best possible time. And there's other clauses in there. Other clause. If the project manager decides that the effective compensation are too uncertain to be forecast reasonably, a reasonable word, he states assumptions about that. So these are project manager's assumptions. Different from a contractor making assumptions in building up a price. These are explicitly stated by a project manager when instructing a quotation. Okay? Assessment of the event is based on these assumptions. Don't price for, I don't know, don't have snow on the ground in December. Yeah? So you're almost, or you are potentially altering the basic risk allocation of the contract, but for a compensation events, that compensation event only when stating assumptions. If any of them is later found to have been wrong, the project manager notifies a correction, and that's a compensation event under clause 60.117. Okay? So in my example, I didn't price for snow on the ground or frozen ground in December, but actually when I came to do that compensation event, it actually did happen, therefore that's now an additional compensation event. So, how's this used? Well, risk management. I know Rob said or slagged off risk management, and I actually did a webinar slagging it off and slagging off the Association for Project Management approach to risk management, saying it's overly complex. But anyway, people recognise this as risk management broadly. Yeah, that's the theory. What did people do in practice? Well, the first thing that people tried to do for risk was just say, construction, it's a risky business. Let's add 10%. I suppose you are identifying risk there. It's construction. It's risky. But are you getting past first base in risk management theory practice? Not really. And the result was no one could ever, on none of the contracts I looked at, anybody could agree what that standard percentage was. There was always arguments about it. The next one was, well, actually, we might have identified risk, some risk, but we're just, oops, what am I there? Oh, that. Okay, right. Okay. He's not. I work with him, he's not. Okay. The other one was try to have a standard percentage based on the type of risk. So we're out working outside in the middle of the winter, doing earthworks or whatever, add 20%. Whereas we're inside a building controlled environment, let's add 5%. But again, you're identifying it, but you're not actually working it through in terms of what do we do about it, etc. How do we address those things? And then the third one, which was sort of more optimal, was this one. Now, you can read the words, but it's best if I give you an example to bring it, or a couple of examples to bring it alive. A real-life project, they were constructing a sewage treatment works. You have big settlement tanks. They go down 5 metres. For some reason, the designers decided to move it around 90 degrees. They had no information on the ground conditions over there. So the contractor had just got on site. There was a back actor on site. They said, well, what can we do to reduce the uncertainty? Well, we've got a back actor. Let's actually dig some trial pits. Yeah, they found pretty much the same ground. So the project manager's assumption was, assume you will find similar ground conditions as you expected to over there. Okay? Now, you could refine that and say, well, actually, we expected to find hard rock at -3 metres, and therefore we had to pecker out from below 3 metres And if you like, double, use a back actor twice, one to pecker out, one to move it. So the project manager could have said, assume that you'll find hard material, which needs peckering out, at -3 metres. Now then you could say, right, okay, well the contractor go, well, I found extra hard material at -2.9 metres, and therefore compensation event for the extra 0.1 metre, okay? But the other thing is then, and it goes back to good practice, is specify strata. Assume you will find hard material at plus or minus 0.2 metres or something like that. Now, if the contractor finds hard material at -2 metres, that's an extra meterish that they have to pecker out. That's a compensation event which pushes up the prices because they're having to do more work. If, on the other hand, it was at -4 metres, that would be an assumption which the compensation event has pushed it up, or might not have. Now it's reducing it, the prices. Okay. Take another example. I want you to dig a hole for a base. We know that groundwater's around there. Okay? Do we bring it? So, okay, what's the risk? Well, first of all, what's the do-nothing consequences? Is it on the critical path? Well, no, it's not on the critical path, and therefore, can you find alternative work? If you do find groundwater, yes, it's not a problem. Okay? Well, add in something for risk if you do it. Do need to get a pump in. First is, well, actually, it is on the critical path. If we don't have a pump there, it's basically going to be an extra day before we can get one in and working, or might be an extra day. That's going to be £5,000 in terms of time-related costs. Well, actually, spending an extra £100 a day on a pump, it's a no-brainer. Okay? Some of those, and therefore it can be priced in. It's not a risk now in terms of groundwater. We're going to do those issues to spend that money to avoid it. On the other hand, if it was off the critical path and you decided not to hire in the pump, if we do come across groundwater, is it an extra compensation event, i.e. it's stated as an assumption, or it's not stated as an assumption, and the contractor takes the risk? Well, you need to set out something for that. And broadly speaking, you're going to do likelihood times impact. Now, one of the criticisms of risk management is they scientify the probabilities, but all the literature on how humans work in terms of guessing probabilities is we are absolutely rubbish at estimating probabilities. We guess them, yeah? So reaching probability times impact. The last one is overcomplication, and that is where on one site, it's a former life. The contractor objected to them having to spend lots of money to work out the consequences if we did find this risk, and they'd argue down to the penny, and then they say, what's the probability? Well, 1 in 10, 1 in 5, divide by 1 in 7.5. Okay? Doing it to that level of detail when essentially probability is a guess and impact is a guesstimate, shall we say. You're arguing too much. And that's one use of assumptions is we're arguing and we're guessing. Yeah? So why don't we just take it out and stop the argument full stop and state it as an assumption? If that event does actually happen, it's just an extra compensation event, yeah? Okay? So, assumptions are a means of refining risk. You can either take them out, take the risk out, avoid any argument. State boundaries within it. If they're too broad, the contractor will add in too much risk. If they're too narrow, there'll automatically be another compensation event. So there's engineering judgment to be exercised in how specific you are about those. And if the contractor goes off and starts preparing their quotation and starts going, well, I'm making a guess here, or I think I want a price on this, or whatever, pick up the phone, have another meeting, discuss it. I've thought about this. When doing the detail, I've come across this. How do you want me to price it? What you don't want to be doing is saying, here's my quotation, and the project manager essentially saying, I haven't seen that before, I disagree with it. Go away and redo it. Yeah? So, other ways of dealing with uncertainty. Break the compensation down into separate compensation events. E.g., I can't price the revised design because we haven't done the revised design yet. So let's have a compensation event for the revise the design. Then having revised the design, we'll have another compensation event for the physical change. There's another example of tunnelling where they can encounter big big flints, as in big flints, when they're expecting little flints in chalk. Well, they priced it on the basis of assume big flints for the next 100 metres as opposed to the whole of the tunnel. And then we'll see where we are if we've stopped doing it. You can also extend the timescales for submitting the quotation by agreement. Okay? So we can't get the quote from the supplier in that time. Well, how long will you? Well, we can get it, they say they can turn it around in 4 weeks. Well, okay, submit the quotation after 4 weeks and 2 days or whatever it is. Or don't include it for that bit of kit. Take that bit out, that's an extra compensation when we get the price in. Break them down into bite-sized bits. Changing method and paying. So this was a big surprise when I was doing research, and it goes back to almost the Richard and Barry's skit. That was the project managers who paid for the contractors' time to actually manage the event thought they got value for money out of doing that. That contractors actually had expertise in managing works. It was, you know, they sort of scratched their heads at the time, but it seems blindingly obvious now. So, and the project managers, as I say, who paid for that, the management time to what's the best way of doing this, apply some real thought to this, got value for money out of it. Okay, so paid them as a professional rather than just a grunt to do work, physical work. Once the changes in methods are agreed, then you can agree the change in resources. Okay, now and delay and disruption. Now people say every compensation event should include time. Now, and therefore, by implication, delay and disruption. If you've got 50 compensation events, some of which are hour long, some of which are 2 or 3 hours long, and every single one you're arguing over delay and disruption or having a discussion over delay and disruption, you're going to have an awful lot of argument in a month. Most sites where they've done this successfully, they've done this informally, but if you want to do it formally, I've given you some wording. Essentially, there's a standard assumption which is stated, which says don't price for delay and disruption, only price for direct costs on this. At the end of the month, we're going to have a wrap-up for that month compensation event to take into account all the delay and disruption. And we'll have one rather than have lots and lots of mini arguments, we'll avoid one huge great argument at the end, but we'll have a monthly bit of an argument. Now the prerequisite is that people are working together. The prerequisite is that people are happy with that at the end of the month, and therefore it can carry on working. But I know lots of projects where that has worked. Most of the time they don't use those wording like that, but I put some wording in there if you want to do it, if you want to do it fully. Okay. Disruption. There's no magic formula. There was one academic who came up with a magic formula for disruption, but it was tried on a number of projects and they said, right, okay, they said this has nothing to do with reality. Disruption's in the detail of the method statements. There isn't a magic formula, but for those reasons people do say it's easier. The devil is in the detail, and therefore you need a detailed, up-to-date program to assess it. Yeah. Delay costs related to extra time on site, but some of those in the unamended contract are in those percentages, so as an employer don't pay twice for those. And then, now what I'm saying here is then having done all of that, assess the methodology, the risks, etc., the change in resources as a result, you then put a cost to them. Now I'm not saying ignore cost, yeah? What I am saying is cost falls out from use of resources. If people have understood and managed resources properly, then the costs are going to be less, and the argument over what those costs are is going to be less. Okay? So while almost the last thing you do is put a cost to it, that's in your mind throughout the whole process. So put cost to the change risks for items direct resources. Particularly options A and B, in the early stages when the QSs are wondering what to do, going home at 3 o'clock instead of 4 o'clock, they might use that last hour to build up a contract cost manual so they can just pick out costs and use it rather than they're discussing it, arguing it at the time of the compensation event. So the back act to cost this, we just pick it out and put it in when the quotation comes along. If they're worked out in the contractor's room, then they can just pick out how much does that back act to cost? Well, such and such. Well, how do I know that? Well, because here's the file which says that's how much I'm hiring it for. I don't need to attach it to the quotation because you've seen the invoice. Yeah? Okay, the level of proof to say that is my cost. But it can also be cost verified by the project manager's QS having read-only any access to the contractor's cost system. And then communicate and iterate. If, just think about this. If you're a project manager and you haven't seen a quotation and not been involved in its development at all, and it comes in, are you going to go, oh, I'm not going to look at the final price and go, I'm going to go look at the contractor's workings first and work through them, yeah? And then just see if the price is right at the end. Or are you going to pick up and go, what's the price, what's the cost? What's the time? Oh, that's a bit higher than I expected. Right, where's my red pen, my figurative red pen? Yeah? And you have had no input into that management. No input into how it's going to be done. Okay? So, work out jointly before the formal submission, and therefore both parties gain the advantages, as well as reducing the negatives. And and I was talking with, I can't remember where it is, this morning. Someone said, if the commercials aren't working on a site, then generally that spreads to other areas. That was my experience when I was on site. It's my experience as a consultant. Collaboration breaks down when the commercials aren't working out. So actually, if you can, and this, believe it or not, someone got a PhD. You can get a PhD for anything these days. When they looked at JCT, and they came to the stunning conclusion that the biggest cause of dispute in construction was assessing the quantum of claims and variations. Amazing that. But just think about it. If you can crack this and turn this into a positive management experience which enhances collaboration, then you've also cracked a major negative force which undermines collaboration elsewhere in the contract. Okay, so that's the overview, revisited. What I would, with Glenn's looking at me in a slightly anxious way, I would, just to reiterate, yeah, okay, fair enough, yeah. As an individual, your final review is what can you take away from this? Even if it's just one thing you can take away, so that when you're assessing or preparing quotations or assessing them, it helps make it easier. What's that one thing? And I won't do the other bit. I was going to get some practical tips from the audience, but I won't. Right.
Okay, thanks so much, Jon and Inga.